Hello, and welcome to our channel. It's a pleasure to have you here. If you enjoy this kind of content, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified whenever we post something new. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy today's fantastic story. Kansas City, Missouri, on a summer night. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the streets were quiet, with only an occasional car passing by. John Campbell, a 32-year-old white police officer, was on his nighttime patrol. He had been with the police department for nearly 10 years, long enough to have seen it all. As he drove through the dark streets, his trained eyes noticed a car that seemed out of place in that neighborhood, a black sedan with tinted windows. "This one's asking to be pulled over," he murmured to himself as he turned on the red and blue lights of his patrol car. He pulled up behind the sedan and approached slowly, one hand on his flashlight, the other on his holster. Inside the car, Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old black man, was heading home after a long day at work. He wasn't unfamiliar with the suspicious gaze of police officers and knew exactly what he should do in such situations. When he saw the lights in his rearview mirror, his heart sank, but he prepared himself, knowing he had to stay calm. John approached the driver's side window and signaled for Marcus to roll it down. "Good evening, sir. License and registration, please," John said, not even looking directly at Marcus. His tone was authoritative, almost dismissive. Marcus took a deep breath and did as he was asked, handing over the documents without saying a word. John took them and started examining them, still not looking at Marcus. "What are you doing out here at this hour? This isn't a neighborhood that gets many visitors." "I'm coming home from work," Marcus replied, his voice calm but tense. "I live just a few blocks away." "Work, huh?" John finally glanced at Marcus, his gaze cold. "What kind of job makes you drive a car like this around here?" "I'm a manager at a tech company," Marcus said, keeping his composure. John let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Sure you are. And this car? Rented? Or did you borrow it from someone?" Marcus swallowed the rising anger. He'd been through this before. "The car is mine, officer. All the paperwork is there." John shook his head, still skeptical. "Get out of the car." "Why? Did I do something wrong?" Marcus asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I said get out," John repeated, this time more firmly. Marcus sighed but complied. As he stepped out of the car, John frisked him, ignoring Marcus's evident discomfort. "You know you shouldn't be around here, right?" John said while patting him down. "People like you don't usually belong in these areas. But I guess you already know that, don't you?" Marcus felt the humiliation burning inside him, but he kept his head up. "I'm just going home, officer. I'm not doing anything wrong." John finished the search without finding anything suspicious. He looked at Marcus, still distrustful, but with no further reason to continue the stop. "You can get back in your car, but keep an eye out, okay? I don't want to see you around here again." Marcus nodded, holding back his frustration. He got back into his car, grabbed his documents, and drove home, his heart still racing. He knew he had been targeted due to prejudice, but, like so many times before, he chose not to let it show. As John watched Marcus drive away, he shook his head, convinced he had done the right thing. "These guys think they can go wherever they want," he muttered to himself before returning to his patrol car and continuing his shift, unaware that that night would change his life forever. Marcus drove the rest of the way home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart was still pounding, but his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had been humiliated once again, but he had swallowed his indignation to avoid a worse situation. What else could he do? As a black man, he knew that the slightest reaction could be misinterpreted. When he finally arrived home, a small apartment in downtown Kansas City, he paused for a moment in the car, trying to calm himself, but the anger and frustration wouldn't leave him. He grabbed his phone and quickly typed a message to his brother, James. Message: "Hey man, I need to talk to you. Something happened today. Call me when you can." He didn't want to go into details over text. He needed to hear his brother's voice, needed to share what he had gone through. Inside the apartment, Marcus sat on the couch, still dressed in his work clothes, his head bowed. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. He answered quickly. "Marcus, what happened?" James's voice was filled with concern. He had always been the protective older brother, and this call was no different. It was a mess, James, Marcus began, taking a deep breath to steady his emotions. I was on my way home and got pulled over by a cop. He humiliated me, treated me like a criminal for no reason. Just because I was driving through a neighborhood he thought I shouldn't be in. James was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with restrained anger. Did he hurt you? Say anything specific? Not physically, Marcus replied with a sigh. But, man, it was awful. He made me get out of the car, frisked me, and insinuated that I couldn't afford the car I was driving. And the worst part is I knew I couldn't react, because if I did, things could have escalated really quickly. James took a deep breath on the other end. Did you get his name or the car number? Yes, Marcus said, a hint of exasperation in his voice. But, James, I don't know if it will do any good. He'll just claim he was doing his job, that he had suspicions, whatever. And I just want this to be over. James was silent again, weighing what to do. Send me the information. I'll see what I can do. James, you don't have to. Yes, I do, James interrupted, firm. This kind of thing can't go unaddressed. I'm going to look into it, Marcus, and I'll make sure he answers for it. No one has the right to treat you like that. Marcus felt a wave of relief at his brother's words, but there was still a shadow of doubt. He knew James wanted to protect him, but he also knew the system didn't always work as it should. Okay, I'll send it, but please, don't do anything that might get you into trouble. Don't worry about that, man. I'll handle it the right way, James replied, his voice firm and resolute. You're not alone in this. After hanging up, Marcus sent the information to James. Sitting on the couch, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He trusted his brother, but he knew the situation could get complicated. He stood up, finally taking off his work clothes, and headed for the shower, hoping the warm water would wash away some of the day's tension. As the water poured over him, Marcus wondered how many more times he would have to go through this, and how many more times he would have to rely on his brother to seek justice in a world where the color of his skin was still seen as a threat. The next morning, James Thompson was sitting in his office at the Kansas City Police Department. He was the local police chief, a man respected for his integrity and commitment to justice. At 35, he had faced many challenges in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the anguish he felt after hearing his brother's account the night before. James looked again at the information Marcus had sent, the officer's name, the patrol car number, and the time of the stop. He knew all the officers under his command, and the name he saw was no surprise. John Campbell was one of his veterans, but also someone who occasionally crossed the line. James picked up the phone and dialed Marcus's number. He needed to hear his brother's voice one more time before deciding what to do. Marcus, it's me, James said as soon as his brother answered. How are you? I'm okay, James, Marcus replied, but his voice still carried the weight of the incident. And you? Have you figured out anything? Yeah, I'm looking into it. I want you to know that I'm taking this seriously, but I also need to do it the right way, James said, trying to reassure him. I'll start by reviewing John's body cam footage. I need evidence before taking any action. Got it, Marcus said with a sigh. Just don't let this become something bigger than it already is. I know you're in a tough spot. James was silent for a moment, feeling his brother's pain and frustration. He knew Marcus didn't want to cause trouble, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. Marcus, you shouldn't have to go through this. It doesn't matter who the officer was, what he did was wrong, and I'm not going to let it slide. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a mix of gratitude and concern. I trust you, James. Just do what you think is right. After hanging up, James felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. As police chief, he knew he had to enforce discipline and justice within the department, but as a brother, his anger was personal. He knew he had to stay calm and act professionally. James accessed the police department's internal system and found John's body cam footage. He mentally prepared himself for what he knew would be difficult to watch. As the video began, he saw John approaching Marcus and asking for his documents. John's demeanor was cold and authoritative from the start. When John began making insinuations about Marcus and his car, James felt his anger rise. With each passing second, James's discomfort grew. He watched Marcus try to stay calm while John frisked him, the humiliation clear on his face. When the video finally ended, James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control the anger and sadness he felt. "This went too far," he murmured to himself. That afternoon, James called John in for a meeting in his office. He knew he had to maintain his position as chief, but Marcus's presence loomed over him like a shadow. When John walked into the office, he was calm and confident, unaware of what was coming. "Chief, you wanted to see me?" James looked at him, trying to control his emotions. "Have a seat, John. We need to talk." John sat down, sensing the tension in the room. "Sure, Chief. What's this about?" James crossed his arms and looked directly into John's eyes. "Last night, you pulled over a car during your shift. I want you to tell me exactly what happened." John frowned, trying to recall. "Oh yeah, a guy driving a black sedan, right? He looked out of place in the neighborhood. I asked for his documents, did a quick frisk, and let him go. All according to protocol." "According to protocol?" James repeated, his voice firm. "I watched the body cam footage, John. What I saw was more than a routine stop. You humiliated that man, made insinuations about him, and treated him like a criminal without cause." John blinked, surprised by James's intensity. "Chief, I was just doing my job. The guy was in a suspicious area, and I needed to make sure nothing was wrong." James leaned forward, his gaze fixed on John. "That guy is my brother, John." Shock took over John's face. He tried to respond, but the words seemed to escape him. I didn't know." "It doesn't matter now," James cut in, his anger barely contained. "What matters is how you treated an innocent citizen. And this isn't just about him being my brother. It's about the kind of officer you're becoming. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in my department." John opened his mouth to defend himself, but James's words hit him like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry, Chief. I really didn't know." James watched him for a moment, his anger mixed with deep disappointment. "You're suspended while a formal investigation is conducted. And in the meantime, I suggest you think carefully about the kind of officer you want to be." John nodded, with nothing more to say. He slowly stood up and left the office, the shock still reverberating in his mind. James remained seated, feeling the weight of what he had done, but knowing he had no other choice. Justice had to be served, even if it was painful for everyone involved. As John walked out of James's office, his mind was in complete turmoil. He couldn't believe he had humiliated the chief's brother. More than that, he couldn't believe his actions had led him to this situation. Feeling lost, John left the station and drove home to his middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Kansas City. As John drove home, memories of his childhood and youth surfaced in his mind. He had grown up in a small town in rural Missouri, a place where racial differences were deeply ingrained. From an early age, John was exposed to conversations that shaped his worldview, conversations he had never really questioned. When he got home, John collapsed onto the living room sofa, exhausted both physically and emotionally. He remembered his father's words, a stern and traditional man who had served as a police officer for over 30 years. "John, the world is divided into us and them," his father used to say, his face hardened by experience. "People like us, hardworking, honest, and people like them, who just cause trouble. Remember that, son. Always stay vigilant." These words had been etched in John's mind since he was young. He grew up believing that the world was indeed divided, that certain groups were inherently suspicious while others deserved trust. When he decided to follow in his father's footsteps and join the police force, these beliefs were further solidified. He saw himself as a protector, someone who maintained order in a dangerous and unpredictable world. But now, sitting on his sofa, his father's words seemed like a distant echo, devoid of the power they once held over him. He had never truly questioned these beliefs. He had never stopped to think if what he had learned throughout his life was wrong. Tears of frustration and confusion began to well up in John's eyes. He tried to recall all the other stops he had made over the years, trying to justify his actions. "I was just doing my job," he whispered to himself, trying to convince himself. I was just protecting the city. But a voice inside him started to question that. Was he really protecting the city? Or was he perpetuating a cycle of prejudice and fear that his father had started? Suddenly, John remembered a conversation he had with his mother many years ago. She was a kind and compassionate woman who often tried to soften the harsh lessons his father imposed. One night, when John was about 16, she sat beside him on the porch while his father was out on a night shift. "John, your father has been through a lot in life," she said, her voice gentle. "He's seen the worst in people, and that's hardened him. But you don't have to carry his burden. You can choose to see the good in people. You can choose to be different." At the time, John hadn't paid much attention to his mother's words. He was determined to follow in his father's footsteps, to be the kind of man he admired. But now, years later, sitting on his sofa, he wondered if his mother had been right all along. Suddenly, John's phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mike, a fellow officer he had worked with for years. "Hey, John," Mike said, his voice filled with concern. "I just heard what happened. Are you okay, man?" John sighed, rubbing his face. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know anything anymore. I feel like everything I thought I was doing right was wrong." "Look, John," Mike said, hesitantly, "I know we learn a lot when we join the force, and a lot of it is stuff we've learned since we were kids. But maybe it's time to stop and think if it all makes sense, you know? Sometimes we need to unlearn some things to be better." John was silent for a moment, Mike's words echoing in his mind. Unlearning. He had never considered that possibility. He had always believed that everything he knew was right, that he was on the right path. But now, for the first time, he began to realize that maybe he had been on the wrong path all along. "Maybe you're right, Mike," John finally said, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "Maybe I need to unlearn some things. If you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me," Mike said before hanging up. John set his phone aside and stared up at the ceiling of his living room. His mother's words, his father's lessons, and Mike's recent advice swirled in his mind. For the first time, John began to seriously think about the choices he had made throughout his life and how he might change. He knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but maybe, just maybe, there was still time for him to become the kind of man his mother always knew he could be. 2 days after John's suspension, James Thompson was in his office reviewing reports when an urgent email arrived. The police union had requested a meeting. They were concerned about John's suspension and wanted to discuss the situation. James had anticipated this. John was a veteran, and the suspension had attracted significant attention at the precinct. At 3 p.m., James walked into the conference room, where a long, oval table was already occupied by some union members and other high-ranking officials. Among them was Captain Rick Howard, an older man with gray hair known for his conservative opinions and resistance to change within the police force. "Chief Thompson," Rick began as James took his seat, "we need to discuss Officer Campbell's suspension. Many here believe it was a hasty decision, made without proper consideration of the circumstances." James looked around at the faces around the table. He knew many of them shared the same training and mindset as John, shaped by years of practices rarely questioned. "I'm listening, Rick, but I want to make it clear from the start that Officer Campbell's behavior does not align with the values this department should represent." Rick shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "With all due respect, James, we all know the streets aren't easy. John was just doing what he was trained to do, protect the community. Sometimes that means being cautious, even overly cautious." "Overly cautious?" James repeated, keeping his calm but feeling the tension rise. "Rick, I reviewed the footage. What I saw wasn't caution. It was an abuse of power. He humiliated a citizen without reason, based solely on his skin color and the car he was driving. But you have to understand that John was trying to do what he thought was right." One of the union members interjected. "He was acting according to the training he received. And now he's being punished for it." James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I understand that John, like many others, was shaped by years of a system that needs change. But that doesn't justify what he did. What I'm trying to say is that we need a new kind of training, one that teaches our officers to see people as individuals, not as potential suspects just because of their appearance." Rick frowned. "And what do you suggest, James? That we soften the training?" That we stop being strict with those who seem suspicious? That won't keep our streets safe. I'm not suggesting we abandon safety, James replied, his voice firm. I'm suggesting we do our job without violating people's rights. We need an approach that balances safety and respect. We need to train our officers to identify real threats without resorting to stereotypes. The room fell silent for a moment, everyone reflecting on James's words. He knew he was touching on a sensitive point, but he also knew these changes were necessary. Rick finally broke the silence. I understand what you're trying to do, James, but the reality is that many of our officers think like John. They've been trained this way, and it's hard to change deeply rooted mindsets. I'm not asking for an overnight change, James responded, softening his tone, but we need to start somewhere. And if we start now, we might, over time, build a police force that not only protects but also serves all members of our community with equality and justice. Rick looked at the other members, who seemed divided. We're going to need time to discuss this among ourselves. But I want you to know, James, that you're going to have a tough road ahead. Many won't accept this change easily. James nodded. I know it will be difficult, but I'm committed to this. And I hope you'll stand by me so we can create an environment where our officers are proud to serve, and where every citizen feels safe and respected. The meeting ended on a note of uncertainty, but James felt that despite the resistance, he had planted a seed. He knew change would come slowly, but he was determined not to back down. For him, this was not just a professional issue, but a personal one. It was about the kind of world he wanted for his brother, Marcus, and for everyone who shared similar experiences. That day, James left the conference room with the feeling that he had taken the first step in a long and challenging journey. But he also knew that to make a real difference, he would need more than words. He would need action, persistence, and above all, the courage to confront the system head-on. As the afternoon turned to evening, John Campbell sat in a local bar, a place where he and his colleagues often gathered to unwind after a day at work. But that night, John didn't feel relaxed. He was lost in thought, his beer almost untouched. The noise of conversations around him was muffled by the echoes of James's words still resonating in his mind. You need to unlearn some things, he recalled Mike saying, and it haunted him. How does one unlearn something that has been taught for a lifetime? How do you reverse a worldview so deeply ingrained? As he sat there, lost in thought, one of his old colleagues, Dave, approached. Dave was a burly man with a booming laugh, who often cracked jokes to lighten the mood. But that night, he seemed to sense the seriousness in John's demeanor. Hey, John, Dave said, pulling up a chair next to him. I heard about what happened. How are you holding up? John gave a slight nod, but kept his eyes on his drink. I don't know, Dave. I think I'm questioning a lot right now. Dave raised an eyebrow, surprised. You? Questioning? That's new. John let out a heavy sigh and finally looked at his friend. It's not so simple anymore, man. I always thought I was doing the right thing, you know? That I was protecting people, doing my duty. But now I don't know anymore. Dave leaned in, intrigued. What do you mean? The guy you stopped, he was acting suspicious, wasn't he? John shook his head, feeling a lump in his throat. He wasn't doing anything wrong, Dave. I treated him poorly, humiliated him, all because he didn't fit my preconceived notion of what a good citizen should be. And to make matters worse, I found out he's the chief's brother. Dave was silent, absorbing John's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than usual. John, we were trained to be suspicious. We learn to see threats where others see normalcy. But if the chief is saying we need to change, maybe he's right. John looked at Dave, surprised by the understanding in his words. Never thought I'd say this, but maybe the chief is right. Maybe we do need to unlearn some things to be better. Dave gave a small smile, placing a hand on John's shoulder. Look, we all make mistakes, especially when we think we're doing the right thing. What matters is learning from them and moving forward. Maybe you can use this as a chance to change, to be a better cop. John was silent for a moment, Dave's words echoing in his mind. He knew Dave was right. He knew he had a choice to make. Continue on the path he had always followed, or try something different, something that could truly make a difference. That night, when John got home, he sat in his small kitchen, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. He looked at the clock on the wall and, after a long moment of hesitation, picked up the phone. John dialed the number he knew so well and waited as the phone rang. After a few seconds, James's voice answered on the other end. "James, it's me, John." There was a pause on the other end before James replied cautiously. "John, what do you want?" John took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest. I wanted to apologize, not just for what I did to your brother, but for how I've been acting over the years. I always thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm not so sure." James was silent for a moment, considering John's words. Finally, he responded, his voice softer than before. "John, what you did was wrong, but the fact that you're questioning it is a step in the right direction. Change isn't easy, but it is possible." "I want to change, James," John said, sincerity evident in his voice. "I want to learn to be a better officer, a better person. I just don't know where to start." James sighed, feeling the gravity of the moment. "The first step is recognizing where you went wrong, and you've already done that. The next step is being open to learning and unlearning. I'll give you a chance, John, but you need to be committed to doing things differently from now on." John nodded, even though James couldn't see him. "I'm committed, James. I don't want to continue being the kind of officer I was." "Then let's start from the beginning," James said. "Come to my office tomorrow. We'll talk about how you can help bring the necessary changes to this department." John felt a wave of relief and hope upon hearing that. "Thank you, James. I really appreciate it." "Don't thank me just yet," James replied firmly. "Show me that you want to change through your actions, not just your words." John hung up the phone, feeling for the first time in a long while that there was a chance for redemption. He knew the journey would be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally start becoming the man he should have always been. The next morning, John woke up earlier than usual. His mind was filled with anxiety, but also with determination. He knew that meeting with James could be a turning point, an opportunity to start fixing the mistakes of the past. After a quick shower, he dressed in his uniform with care, as if preparing for something more than just a regular workday. Arriving at the precinct, John felt curious and perhaps judgmental glances from his colleagues. It was as if they knew something had changed, that he was no longer the same officer who walked the halls just days before. He ignored the murmurs and headed straight to James's office. James was seated at his desk, his eyes fixed on a report, but he looked up as soon as John entered the room. There was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of distrust and expectation. John closed the door behind him and stood, waiting for James to speak first. "Good morning, John," James said, folding his hands on the desk. "Please have a seat." John complied, feeling a bit like a student about to be reprimanded. He knew he had a lot to explain, a lot to make up for. "Thank you for meeting with me, James." James nodded, keeping a stern look. "I said yesterday that it wouldn't be easy, and I stand by that. But I want you to understand that if you really want to change, you'll have to face some challenges." "I understand," John replied sincerely. "I'm ready for that." James was silent for a moment, evaluating John with a look that mixed skepticism and hope. "Let's start with the basics. I want you to participate in a new training program we're developing, focused on addressing biases and building relationships with the community. But that's just the beginning. We need to go beyond." John leaned forward, showing his commitment. "I want to learn, James. I want to understand where I went wrong and how I can do better." James sighed, recognizing that despite past mistakes, John was genuinely trying to change. "Very well. But there's something you need to do first, something that will require more from you than any training." John furrowed his brow, confused. "What is it?" James looked John in the eye, his expression serious. "You need to apologize to Marcus." The room fell silent. John felt the weight of James's words settling over him. Apologizing to Marcus, the man he had humiliated, James's brother. It was the right thing to do, but it was also the hardest. I was expecting this," John said, his voice low. "But how? After everything I've done, how can I face him?" James leaned forward, his voice firm but not without compassion. "You'll do it with sincerity. It won't be easy, but it's necessary. Marcus needs to hear from you, face to face, that you understand what you did wrong and that you're willing to change. John nodded, feeling the tension in his chest intensify. I'll do it. I know I need to. I'll set up a meeting with Marcus, James said, already picking up the phone. I can't promise he'll want to speak with you, but I'll explain the situation. If he agrees, you'll get your chance. John remained silent while James made the call. He heard James's formal tone as he spoke with Marcus, explaining the situation. There was a long pause during which John felt like everything might fall apart. Finally, James hung up the phone and looked at him. He agreed, James said. But, John, I want you to understand something. Marcus is a good person, but he's deeply hurt. This conversation won't be easy. John took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. I understand, and I'm ready to face whatever is necessary. That afternoon, John headed to a small cafe downtown, the place where James had arranged the meeting with Marcus. His hands were sweaty, and he felt his heart pounding in his chest. When he arrived, he saw Marcus sitting at a table in the corner, with a serious and closed-off expression. John hesitated for a moment, but then approached. Marcus looked up when he saw him, and for a moment, John saw the pain and anger reflected in his eyes. Marcus, John said, his voice hesitant but sincere. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He watched John for a few seconds before speaking, his voice controlled. I almost didn't come, but my brother insisted, said you were trying to change. So, here I am. John took the seat opposite Marcus, trying to find the right words. I want to start by apologizing for what I did, for how I treated you. I know there's no excuse for it, but I truly am sorry. Marcus crossed his arms, still with a stern expression. Do you know how I felt that day, John? I felt like my worth as a person was stripped away in minutes. And it wasn't just because you're a police officer. It was because you did it just because of the color of my skin. Marcus's words hit John like a punch to the gut. He lowered his head, feeling the shame burning inside him. I know, Marcus. I know I messed up badly, and I'm trying to understand how I let this happen, how I became the kind of person who does something like that. Marcus remained silent for a moment, as if assessing John's sincerity. Finally, he sighed. John, change isn't going to be easy. I grew up learning to protect myself from people who think like you used to. I can't just forget what happened. But if you're truly committed to changing, I'll try to look beyond it. John looked at Marcus, feeling a wave of relief mixed with pain. Thank you, Marcus. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, but I want you to know that I'll work hard to be a better person. I don't want anyone else to go through what you went through. Marcus relaxed a bit, but still maintained a cautious posture. We'll see, John. Words are easy, but actions speak louder. And I'll be watching. John nodded, fully understanding. I get it, and I promise my actions will show that I'm serious. The conversation ended there, with a lingering sense of tension, but also a faint glimmer of hope. As Marcus stood up to leave, he looked at John one last time, with an expression that mixed distrust and possibility. Good luck, John, Marcus said before walking out of the cafe. John sat there for a moment, reflecting on the meeting. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt he was on the right path. And while he couldn't change the past, he could work hard to ensure the future would be different. In the days following his meeting with Marcus, John Campbell threw himself into the new training program implemented by James Thompson. It was a dramatic shift from the traditional training he had received over the years. The seminars were led by social justice experts and community members who had faced discrimination, including Marcus. It was an intensive course in unlearning, and John felt the weight of this new journey. On that Tuesday, he found himself in a conference room at the precinct, along with other officers participating in the program. Most of the faces present were marked by skepticism, some even hostility. Many, like John, were used to seeing the world in black and white, dividing people into those who obeyed the law and those who broke it. But this training required them to see the nuances, to recognize their own biases. That morning session was led by Dr. Karen Mitchell, a black woman in her early 40s, with a confident demeanor and a firm yet welcoming voice. She was there to talk about the impact of institutional racism on people's lives, and her approach was direct and no nonsense. "Let's talk about how you view the people you encounter on the street," Karen said, walking around the room and making eye contact with each officer. "I want you to be honest with yourselves and with each other. How do you decide who looks suspicious? What goes through your mind when you see someone like me, for example, walking in a neighborhood where you wouldn't expect to see me?" John felt a lump form in his throat. He knew these were questions he should have asked himself a long time ago, but he never had. In the room, the silence was heavy until an officer next to John, a younger man named Tom, raised his hand. "To be honest, I think we tend to be more suspicious of people who don't seem to belong in certain places," Tom said, a bit hesitantly. "It's like an instinct, I guess. Something we learn over time." Karen nodded, with an understanding look. "That's what we call implicit bias, Tom. And you're not alone in this. We all have our prejudices, many of which are reinforced by the environment we grew up in and the experiences we've had. But what we need to recognize is that these biases, when left unchallenged, lead to injustices. And your role as officers is to ensure justice, not reinforce discrimination." John knew it was time to speak up. He took a deep breath before speaking. I made a serious mistake recently, Dr. Mitchell. I let my biases influence an encounter and ended up humiliating a man who hadn't done anything wrong. I'm here because I want to learn. I want to understand how to prevent this from happening again." Karen looked at John, assessing his sincerity. "Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, John. But true change requires more than recognition. You need to re-educate your mind and your heart. And that means being willing to face uncomfortable truths about yourself." The conversation continued, and John listened intently as others shared their experiences and insecurities. There was a sense of vulnerability in the room, an openness to admitting failures that was hard for many to endure. But John realized this was the only way to grow, to become the kind of officer he now aspired to be. After the training session, John met with James in his office. There was something different in the air between them now, a shift in dynamics. John no longer saw James merely as his boss. He saw him as someone guiding him on a path to redemption. "How was the session?" James asked as John settled into the chair in front of his desk. "It was intense," John admitted, running a hand through his hair. "It made me think about a lot of things I had never considered before, but I think it's a good thing. I'm starting to understand the depth of my mistakes." James nodded, satisfied with the response. "That's a good sign, John. Change isn't easy, but you're on the right path. Remember, this process isn't just for you. It's also for those you serve and protect. It's about being part of a police force that truly understands and respects the community it operates in." John sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on James's words. "I know I have a lot to learn, and I know it won't be easy to regain people's trust, especially Marcus's." James looked at John with a serious but encouraging expression. "Time will show your intentions, John. Marcus is a fair man, but he, like many others, is tired of empty promises. Show through your actions that you've changed. Be present, listen, and above all, act with integrity." John nodded, determined. "I'll do that, James, and I'll start now. I'm going to get more involved in the community, talk to people, listen to what they have to say. I want them to know that I'm here to serve them, not to judge them." James gave a slight smile, an expression reflecting both approval and hope. "That's what I want to hear, John. Remember, this isn't a journey you make alone. You have the support of people like me, like Dr. Mitchell, and even Marcus, even if he doesn't know it yet." As John left the office, he felt a new energy within him, a renewed conviction. He knew the path ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. He knew he was beginning to become the man and the officer he should have been from the start, someone worthy of respect, not just for his position, but for his actions and character. He left the precinct with a clear purpose: to rebuild the bridges he had broken, both within himself and with the community he had sworn to protect. And he knew that although the road would be difficult, he was ready to take every necessary step toward redemption. In the days that followed, John Campbell dedicated himself to rebuilding his reputation, not just as a police officer, but as a human being. He knew that gaining the community's trust would be a slow and demanding process. As part of his new approach, he began attending community meetings where neighborhood members discussed their issues and concerns with the police. One such meeting took place on a warm Thursday evening in the gymnasium of a local school. The atmosphere was charged with tension. It was evident that many attendees were there to voice frustrations and accumulated resentments. John entered the gym and found a place at the back, observing the faces that turned in his direction. He could feel the hostility in the air, but he knew he had to face it head-on. The meeting was moderated by an elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, who opened the session with a brief speech about the importance of collaboration between the police and the community. "We're here today to speak openly, to listen and be heard," he said, looking at the audience. "It's time to build bridges, but that will only happen if we're willing to talk and listen with open hearts." When the floor was open to the public, the initial comments were harsh. Several residents expressed their distrust of the police, mentioning incidents of abuse of power and discrimination. John listened attentively, feeling the weight of their words and knowing that, in some ways, he was part of the problem they were describing. Finally, an older woman, Mrs. Martinez, took the floor. She stood up slowly, with the support of a cane, and looked directly at John. "I've lived here for 40 years, she began, her voice firm despite her age. "And during that time, I've seen the police treat our young people as criminals even before they had a chance to prove otherwise. I don't see officers walking in our streets, talking to our kids, building trust. They only show up when there's trouble, and even then, not to help, but to intimidate." Mrs. Martinez's words resonated throughout the gym, and John knew it was his turn to speak. He stood up slowly, feeling all eyes on him. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand what you're saying, and I know I can't erase what's been done in the past," he began, his voice low but clear. "But I'm here today because I want to change that. I want to start rebuilding the trust that's been lost, not just with words, but with actions." The room fell silent, waiting for what he would say next. "I've made mistakes, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't," John continued, feeling the need to be completely honest. "I've treated people the way you've described, and I'm ashamed of that. But I'm here to listen, to learn, and to do better. I want to work with you, not against you." There was a murmur in the crowd, and John saw that while distrust was still present, there was also a seed of curiosity and perhaps even hope. Mrs. Martinez looked at him with a penetrating gaze before speaking again. "Words are good, John, but as you said, we need actions. How do you plan to prove that you're sincere?" John nodded, having anticipated this question. "I want to start by being more actively involved in community activities. Walking the streets, getting to know the people, being available not just as a police officer, but as a neighbor. I'm also participating in a new training program that teaches us to confront our own biases, to see beyond the stereotypes we've been given. And more than that, I'm here to hear your suggestions. How can I help? How can we work together to improve this relationship?" A young man in the front row, a teenager about 17 years old, raised his hand. "Are you really going to walk in our neighborhood, John? How will we know you're not just pretending to be nice to get our trust, and then going back to how things were?" John looked directly at the boy and responded earnestly. "You have every right to be skeptical, and I'm not going to try to convince you with empty promises. But yes, I will walk in your neighborhood. And not just once, but regularly. I will be there, and I hope that over time you'll see that I'm trying to make a difference. But I know it won't happen overnight. I'm willing to earn that trust one step at a time." The boy nodded slowly, still skeptical but less defensive. "I'll hold you to that, John." The meeting continued with more discussions, but John noticed a subtle shift in the overall tone. There was still distrust, but there was also an openness to dialogue, something he knew was crucial. When the meeting ended, several people approached him, some to ask questions, others just to observe. John responded to everyone with patience and honesty, feeling that each interaction was a small victory. As he left the gym, John found Marcus waiting outside. The surprise was immediate, but he quickly composed himself. "Marcus," he said, stopping beside the man he had deeply hurt. "I saw you in there," Marcus said, with an expression that was hard to read. "It wasn't easy for you, was it?" John shook his head. "No, it wasn't, but I needed to be there. And I'll keep going, because I know this is just the beginning." Marcus crossed his arms, watching John intently. "I'm still processing everything that's happened, but I have to admit I'm surprised you're actually trying. It's not common to see someone like you admit their mistakes and work to change them." John looked at Marcus, feeling the weight of the moment. "I can't change the past, Marcus, but I can work to make a different future. And I'll keep trying, not just for you, but for everyone I've let down." Marcus was silent for a moment before responding. "Trust is built slowly, John. You still have a lot to prove, but I'll be around, watching. Maybe one day, we can even work together to make this city better." John nodded, feeling a mix of relief and responsibility. "I look forward to that day, Marcus. And until then, I'll keep doing what I can to show that I'm changing." The two men parted with a nod, a simple gesture that carried the promise of future understanding. As John walked away, he knew that the journey was far from over. But now, more than ever, he was committed to walking the path back, step by step, rebuilding the bridges he had broken and finding a greater purpose in his role as both a police officer and a man. The following months brought a series of new challenges and lessons for John Campbell. His days were filled with community activities and working on new programs aimed at improving the relationship between the police and the community. He was making an effort to be present at local events, neighborhood meetings, and even school functions, where he interacted with young people and their families, trying to distance himself from the negative image he had previously created. One Friday afternoon, John was organizing a community safety fair in the city's Central Park. There were booths with safety information, presentations from local organizations, and even activities for the kids. John was talking to some residents and answering questions when he saw Marcus approaching. "Marcus," John called out, raising his hand in a friendly gesture. "Good to see you here." Marcus approached with a neutral expression, but John noticed that his tone was more cordial than before. "Hello, John. I thought it was a good opportunity to see what you've been up to." "I'm glad you came," John replied. "I'm trying to make a difference, one step at a time. These fairs are a way for us to connect more with the community." As they talked, a group of children gathered around one of the booths where John was explaining safety and crime prevention. He crouched down to speak with them, answering questions about how to stay safe and what to do if they encountered a suspicious situation. Marcus watched, noting the patience and attention John was giving the kids. When John returned to the conversation, Marcus seemed a bit more relaxed. "I see you're really putting in the effort," Marcus commented. "Engaging with the kids is a good step. It shows you're willing to be more approachable." John smiled, feeling a bit relieved by the positive reaction. "I'm trying. It's important to me that the community sees I'm here to help, not to be a threat." "It's a start," Marcus said, with a slight smile. "But more is needed. How are you handling the training and the new responsibilities?" "I'm learning a lot," John admitted. "The training is intense, and it's making me reflect on many things I never considered before. I'm also beginning to understand better the impact our actions can have." Marcus nodded, watching John with a more thoughtful look. "Good to hear. But remember, real change takes time. Trust isn't something you earn overnight. It's an ongoing process." John agreed, feeling the weight of Marcus's words. "I understand, and I'm willing to keep working on it, no matter how long it takes. I believe that with continuous effort, I can help build something better." At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by a group of residents who approached with questions about safety. John immediately turned to them with an attentive and receptive look. Marcus watched from a distance, seeing John's genuine commitment. The following week, John attended a city council meeting where he was invited to present the results of the community initiatives he had helped coordinate. The meeting was filled with local leaders, representatives from community organizations, and other police officers. John knew it was an important opportunity to showcase the progress he had made and also to hear feedback from the community. James Thompson was present, watching attentively as John presented the results. John had prepared a detailed report that included statistics on increased community engagement, positive feedback from events, and even success stories of interactions between the police and residents. "We're seeing real change in how the community perceives the police," John said as he displayed graphs and testimonials on the projector. "Participation in our events has increased significantly, and we're receiving positive feedback about our involvement in schools and neighborhood meetings." After the presentation, Mr. Jenkins, who had been the mediator at the previous community meeting, raised his hand. John, it's good to see the progress you're making. But, as you know, real change is seen in consistency. How do you plan to ensure that these initiatives continue and expand? John looked at Jenkins seriously. We're establishing a continuous working group made up of community members and officers to ensure that feedback is implemented and that community needs are constantly assessed. The idea is to create a feedback loop where we can adjust and improve our approaches based on the responses we receive. Another council member, a woman named Laura, also had a question. What about the training? How are you handling resistance within the department? John took a deep breath before responding. Resistance is definitely a challenge, but we're working to create a culture of accountability and openness within the police force. This includes ongoing training and encouraging honest discussions about biases and practices. It's not an easy task, but it's essential to ensure everyone on the team aligns with the new standards. After the meeting, John was approached by several community members who expressed their appreciation for the work he was doing. He also received praise from colleagues and, of course, from James, who found him outside the conference room. "You did a good job in there," James said with a smile. "Clearly, there's still a lot to do, but you're heading in the right direction." John smiled, a bit tired but satisfied. "Thanks, James. I'm learning the importance of persistence and consistency. It's a long process, but I feel like we're starting to make a difference." James nodded in understanding. "That's exactly right. And remember, this work is as much about action as it is about listening. Keep pushing to improve and stay open to feedback. That's how you'll really make a difference." As John left the meeting, he felt more confident and determined than ever. He knew the journey was far from over, but every step taken, every positive interaction, was a move towards real change. He was beginning to see the fruits of his hard work, and that motivated him to keep dedicating himself, both for his own sake and for the community he had sworn to protect and serve. John Campbell continued to dedicate himself to rebuilding the relationship between the police and the community, but he knew his redemption journey was far from complete. The greatest test of his commitment and growth was yet to come. The opportunity arose when a new, unexpected, and complicated incident demanded his attention. It was a Thursday afternoon when John received a call about a domestic violence case involving a young couple in an area known for having a tense relationship with the police. The call was directed to him because he was one of the few officers directly involved in community initiatives and had already established some level of trust with the community. John arrived at the scene, a small apartment in a low-income housing complex, and found the situation more difficult than he had anticipated. The woman, named Jennifer, was visibly agitated and had clear signs of abuse. The man, whose name was Kyle, was in a state of denial, trying to justify his actions. "Jennifer, I need you to calm down so we can sort this out," John said in a calm voice, trying to convey reassurance and support. "We can talk about what happened and see how we can help." Jennifer looked at him with tear-filled eyes. He always does this, but it's never been this bad before. I just want him to stop." John turned to Kyle, who was standing with his arms crossed and visibly irritated. "Kyle, you need to understand that what you did is unacceptable. Violence is never the answer. We're here to help, but we need you to cooperate." Kyle scoffed and stepped closer to John, challenging him with his gaze. "You don't understand anything about what goes on here. You guys only show up when things are already bad. Why should we trust you now?" John took a deep breath, trying to stay calm in the face of the provocation. "I know trust is something that has to be earned, and I understand you're frustrated. But I'm here to make sure what happened today doesn't happen again. What you're doing here at home isn't just a legal issue. It's about respect." Jennifer, still trembling, interrupted. "Please, John, just help me get out of this situation. I don't want to live like this anymore." John nodded and turned back to Kyle. "We're going to handle this the right way. Jennifer will be taken to a temporary shelter where she can be safe, and you will need to answer for your actions. This might not solve all your problems immediately, but it's an important step toward ensuring her safety." Kyle, visibly shaken, looked at Jennifer and then at John, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. "I didn't want things to get this far." "You can start to change now, Kyle," John replied. but it begins with taking responsibility for what happened and seeking help. There are resources available to help you deal with your issues. The incident left John reflecting on the complexity of his work and the multiple layers involved in community interactions. The next day, he met with James to discuss the case and the challenges he had faced. "It was a tough situation," John said as he settled into James's office chair. "I tried to be as empathetic as possible, but I know that's not enough to solve all the problems." James looked at John with an understanding expression. "You did the best you could in the situation. These cases are complex and require more than an immediate response. They need ongoing follow-up." "Yes, and that's what worries me," John admitted. "How can I ensure that the changes I'm trying to implement really make a difference in the lives of people who need help? How can I follow up and make sure we're helping the community in the right way?" James leaned forward, considering John's words. "It's important not just to respond to these cases, but also to work on prevention. That means collaborating with local organizations, providing resources for support, and continuing to follow up with the people you help. And more importantly, keep building trust. Change comes with time and persistence." John nodded, understanding the need for a broader approach. "I'll do that. I'll get more involved with organizations that deal with victims of violence and ensure we have an effective follow-up system. We can't just act when problems arise. We need to work to prevent them." James smiled, pleased with John's determination. "That's right. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. There's a whole team here to support you. The key is to keep striving and be transparent about what you're doing." At the end of the week, John met with Marcus again, this time to discuss how they could work together more effectively to address domestic violence and community support. They met at a local cafe, a neutral place where they could talk without pressure. "Marcus, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we can improve our support for cases like Jennifer and Kyle's," John began. "I feel there's an urgent need to integrate community resources more and offer more consistent support." Marcus looked at John with interest. "I agree. Domestic violence is a serious issue, and we need a more holistic approach. We can work together to connect victims with the right resources and ensure they have the ongoing support they need." "Great," John said with a smile. "I'm committed to doing that. Let's start by bringing together local organizations that work with victims and see how we can collaborate to create an action plan that's both effective and sustainable." Their conversation was productive, with Marcus sharing valuable information about organizations and resources that could be utilized. John left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose and a clear plan for the next steps. He knew that the work wouldn't be easy and that trust and change would take time. But with every step he took, every sincere interaction, and every effort to improve, he was starting to see that he was on the right path to making a real difference in people's lives and rebuilding trust in the police and the community he had sworn to protect. After months of hard work and facing tough challenges, John Campbell finally saw a light at the end of the tunnel. His efforts to build a stronger relationship with the community were beginning to bear fruit, and the recognition of his transformation was becoming more evident. It was a Friday afternoon, and John was attending a recognition ceremony at the city auditorium, where several community leaders and police officials were present. The event celebrated the progress made in improving the relationship between the police and the community, and John was among those honored for his efforts and dedication. James Thompson was on stage, about to announce the honorees. He looked at John and gestured for him to come forward. "Today, we want to recognize those who have made a significant effort to improve the relationship between the police and the community. It's a challenging but essential job, and we are here to celebrate those who have led with integrity and commitment." The audience, made up of local residents and John's colleagues, applauded as he made his way to the stage. James continued, "John Campbell has shown remarkable effort in understanding the community's concerns and working to address complex issues. His commitment to engaging directly, listening to the community, and implementing changes is an example for all of us." John received the award with humility, feeling the weight of his journey reflected in the words and recognition. "Thank you, James," he said, taking the microphone. "This award is not just for me, but for everyone who has worked together to make our city a better place. I acknowledge that there have been many mistakes along the way, but I am committed to continuing to learn and work to ensure that the trust and cooperation between the police and the community are strengthened." After the speech, John was approached by several community members who came to express their appreciation for the work he was doing. Among them was Marcus, who had come to support John and see the results of the work they had done together. "Congratulations, John," Marcus said, shaking John's hand with a smile. "You've really made a difference. I'm impressed by how much you've managed to change the community's perception." "Thank you, Marcus," John replied, genuinely grateful. "I wouldn't have gotten here without the support and guidance of people like you. There's still a lot of work ahead, but I'm excited about the progress we're making." "Yes, there's still much to be done," Marcus agreed. "But seeing you here today, receiving this recognition, is a significant step. Continuing to build on that is what will truly make a difference." As they talked, James joined the conversation. "I wanted to congratulate both of you on your incredible work. Marcus, your collaboration has been crucial, and John, your commitment is inspiring." John and Marcus exchanged looks of understanding and satisfaction. "The partnership between the police and the community is essential," Marcus said. "And this ceremony is a great example of how we can work together to create real change." "Absolutely," John added. "I hope this is just the beginning. We need to keep listening, learning, and collaborating to ensure our efforts lead to lasting improvements." After the event, John and Marcus decided to celebrate at a nearby cafe, reflecting on the progress made and discussing the next steps. They sat at a quiet table, away from the bustle of the auditorium. "It's nice to have a moment to relax and reflect," John said, enjoying his coffee. "There's still a lot of work to be done, but this recognition is a sign that we're on the right track." Marcus nodded, looking at John with a look of respect. "You've done an excellent job, John, not just with the visible changes, but also in the way you've tackled challenges and learned from them. That's what really matters." John smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I appreciate you being by my side throughout this process, and I'm also grateful to the community for giving us a chance to make a difference." Marcus raised his cup in a toast, "To change and to the future. May we continue to make a difference, one step at a time." John raised his cup in response, with a renewed sense of hope. "To change and to the future." As they toasted and talked about the challenges and triumphs ahead, John knew that the journey was far from over. But with each step taken, each lesson learned, and each sincere interaction, he was paving the way for a more promising future. The recognition he had received was just the beginning, and he was ready to continue his work with a new sense of purpose and commitment.